You might feel this culture has radically shifted away, and you would be right, but that doesn't mean God has left you or left us. What's fascinating to me is the story of Daniel says God has joined his people in exile. God himself goes into exile with his people. God is right here with us in the midst of all of this that's going on. Now, when Israel did come back 70 years later, started to trickle back to the land of Judah, the exile in a lot of ways, the rabbis would say later on, never really ended. They might be back on that piece of real estate, but it was never the same. They rebuilt the temple, but God's glory never filled it again. They never had another king. They never were really in charge of their land. They were still awaiting hundreds of years, and Daniel's prophecies would talk about this later on in this book. They would wait hundreds of years until finally God comes to them in exile in his own Son, Jesus Christ. And Jesus is kind of like Daniel, but even greater. Because Jesus himself stands before the powers that be in his day, the representative of Caesar himself. He took a stand before both Caiaphas the high priest, but also Pontius Pilate. And there Jesus stood both definitively, wisely, respectfully, faithfully. But unlike Daniel, who was delivered, whom God showed his favor, who had his hand on him and protected him from the mouths of lions, his friends from the fiery furnace, Jesus Christ would experience the vicious mouths of human beings and the curse of God himself and the fiery trials and all of hellish torment upon the cross. It's the one time God abandoned his own Son so that he'd never abandon you. Jesus is the better Daniel, who lives that flawless, loving, wise life, who takes the stand, who shows courage in a culture that had actually wandered away from God and was using God's rules against God. But in so doing, Jesus opens up the grace of God upon which you can stand. That you know there is no place, no time, no space, no instance where you will ever be left alone. Jesus is always there with you, no matter the exile, no matter the location. You know? So basically, it's kind of time to stop. Where did I put it? Looking at your screen for your validation, for your direction, for your identity, for what other people think. It's time maybe, like Daniel and his friends, to stand on the one firm thing: God's promises, God's grace, God's presence in your life. And this culture needs you to do that, because this culture is just drowning in anxiety and depression and anti-community issues, anti-social things that are going on. It needs us to serve and to love and to give, to stand as Daniel did, to serve as Jesus did, to love as God has loved us. So stand we will.